Hello and welcome to Mobilizing the Future of Fleets, a podcast dedicated to helping fleet operators navigate the road ahead. I'm Barney Goffer, and today we are covering the topic of privacy and governance. Now, as fleet operators adopt new technology to address their challenges of improving efficiency, safety and sustainability, the complexities of managing privacy and governance only increase. Today, we'll unpack this topic to help understand the considerations when deploying fleet management solutions, dash cams, and the emerging opportunities AI brings to our industry. Now, we're in great hands today. Our guest, Srikant Mikkilineni, is an attorney and chief counsel for global information and privacy for Vontier Corporation. With over 10 years experience providing privacy, IP, product and technology counsel for businesses worldwide, Srikant is a certified privacy law specialist and IAPP fellow of information privacy. Now, put simply, he's a leader in the field of privacy law. Welcome to the podcast, Srikant.
Yeah, thanks, Barney. Yeah, it's great to be here. Glad to get the invite. I do just need to start with just kind of the standard lawyer response of what we talk about today shouldn't be taken as legal advice. And any opinions that I give are going to be my own opinions, not that of Vontier's.
Thanks, Srikant. And yeah, totally understand that. So let's start with some questions and understanding the landscape. And when you answer this question, can you think of it from a global perspective of where our customers are? And what are the key regulations that fleet operators should be aware of regarding data governance and privacy?
Yeah, I mean, this first question is a podcast by itself, right? If you wanted to get into it. But broadly speaking, there are dozens, if not more than that, regulations across the world. In the US alone, there are 20 states with comprehensive privacy laws. So that's before you get into the sector-specific privacy laws. Then you have federal in the US, and we haven't even moved outside the US yet.
Right. Yeah.
There is the bigger fish in the sea here is GDPR, as far as privacy laws within Europe and the UK. But there's also a number of other country laws like PIPL, POPIA, LGPD, PDPA, right? So lawyers love acronyms, businesses love acronyms. So, there's tons of acronyms to go around here. But what I really would encourage listeners to think about is to find those commonalities across these different regulations and regimes. A lot of them are looking to achieve the same goal on some level. They may require slightly different things to get there. And by no means should you ignore those requirements, but if you have the end goal in mind, it makes it easier to see commonalities across these different regulations.
Okay. I'll Google the acronyms later and find out what they are. But then I guess the next question, just briefly in relation to the commonality piece there that you mentioned as well, how does that relate to ethical considerations that come into play when you're managing data in fleet operations?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it comes down to making sure you're giving the user choices, informed choices, I should say, whenever possible. That means being transparent. It means giving them consent options if that's appropriate. But it kind of comes down to the old adage of treat others as you want to be treated, right? So when you're building these solutions or you're onboarding new vendors that are going to be processing these kinds of data, make sure that if it was your data that's being transferred to them, you feel comfortable with how they're using it, right? And what they're doing with that data.
If we move on slightly and we think about operating within fleet management solutions as well, then so how can fleet operators ensure that their tracking systems, their telematics solutions, things like vehicle checks, driver behaviour, quite sensitive data, monitor and how the monitoring of that can comply with legal standards?
It takes a team effort, right? There's no way to say let's put one attorney in charge of this and then we're done, right? fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your viewpoint, right? It is a team effort in order to make sure, the legal counsel can provide guidance and they can build a program that says, okay, here are the 6, 7, 8 activities that you need to undertake or that you need to make sure are happening. But beyond that, it's really about making the culture of the company kind of data aware, right? It's about making sure that everybody has at least some sort of thought in the back of their head. Maybe it's not everything that they focus on day in, day out, but they have a thought in the back of their head of, okay, I just accessed a customer's dash cam footage because I needed to provide support. What should I do with that local cache copy that I created in order to provide that support, right? For most people, it's an afterthought because there's just too many things to do, right? You're moving from one call to the next. So it's messages from leadership, it's messages from business owners or the people in charge, essentially saying, hey, no, this is important. I know it's going to take a little bit of time, but it only takes a few seconds if you do it right, and you have the mechanisms to help them do that efficiently. That's the ideal scenario.
Yeah, okay. You might have answered my next question in part there with some of that, but I'll ask it anyway and see if it changes slightly. But it was what does good look like when it comes to building up trust with drivers and customers, whilst you're collecting sensitive data. And the really sensitive data that we see out there today is actually the dashcam footage, right? And we're going to get into that in a bit more detail in a second as well.
Yeah. So, and there are a lot of aspects of data that you don't necessarily think, or maybe it's not even sensitive by itself, right? But when you add a few other factors to it, it can become quite sensitive, right? So generally my browsing history, probably not overly sensitive on my corporate machine, right? But there are examples where that may change, right? I may be trying to sign up, my kids for my health plan, for example. That all of a sudden becomes very sensitive. So the important thing when you're trying to build trust with employees and external customers, at least in my mind, is making sure you're giving them a choice whenever possible, right? There are some things that you just have to collect some level of information in order to, for example, be a paid employee, right? Everybody wants to be a paid employee. Nobody wants to work for free. So there is an aspect of, there's a certain level of information the employer just needs in order to, fulfill that activity. But being transparent about that, right? And then also making sure that use is not overbroad. So for example, if you were to collect my information as an employee of your company, to do payroll, for example,
yeah,
it would break trust if you then took that information and sold it to a third-party marketer to say, hey, my employee makes this much money. They can buy a few extra, widgets at your store.
Sure.
Right. So that will very quickly break trust. Right. There may be an aspect of, oh, they'll never know, but Cambridge Analytica taught us a lot about that.
Yeah. Didn't it just? Yeah. Interesting story, that one. We won't get into that though.
Yeah.
So I know we keep talking about dash cams, and it feels like that's a good place to actually go next. So if we're thinking about implementing dash cam technology, quite frankly, that's just a massive thing for our organisation and the telematics space. Video telematics growth is huge. It's been great for solving problems really well. It solves some great problems, right? It's really, helped in many instances, but it has raised a lot of questions as well. So when we think about the problems that kind of come with it, then what would you say are the critical considerations for operators when they're implementing their dash cams, both forward facing, but also driver facing as well?
Yeah, and I think some of it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, as far as making sure that you're letting those drivers know up front, hey, there's a camera that's even if it should be obvious, right? There may be a camera that's just like staring you in the face. It's still good practice just to help build that trust, in my experience, to say, hey, you're going to notice this camera. It is recording you, and here are the scenarios. Ideally, you tell them, here are the scenarios under which it records, right? And a lot of times you can do this through a privacy notice, but I would actually recommend, especially for folks that you're gonna have a constant touch with, right? People like employees or close customers, things like that. It's always good practice. Again, it goes back to how would you want to be treated, right? Instead of putting it into a 14-page privacy notice, give them a bullet point list, right? Make it easy for them to understand what it is that you're actually trying to achieve. You can still have, I'm an attorney. I'm not going to advocate against privacy notices. That's something that is definitely needed. But it's always nice to have kind of an executive summary of sorts, or whatever you want to call it, right? Just something that's a little bit more digestible, easy to read, easy to understand. We can do any number of things to try to achieve that. FAQs, support calls, whatever the right level of touch is.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is for external folks, it's as simple as putting things like a sticker in the window to let them know, hey, this vehicle has a camera on board and will record.
Sure. Okay. Again, it just feels like common sense prevails before anything else, right?
And on the technical, we've been keeping this higher level because there is a whole, I mean, if you wanted to go into the deep end, we could spend hours on that. I think you'd lose a lot of your viewership if we went down that road.
Yeah. Okay.
But there is an aspect of making sure you've got the right protocols on the back end, right? Like making sure that you've got right retention schedules, you've got, right security controls, appropriate encryption levels, if that is one of the appropriate controls. So there's a lot on the technical side that I think we'd have to delve pretty deep to get into in a meaningful way.
Which we obviously do as an organization, and yeah, it's kind of like expected that is going to be there. So this is really about the real world use of the technology and making sure that it is safe, legally compliant, and not going to make any infringements, right? So anything else that you can give us then or talk to in terms of best practices for integrating dashcam technology over and above what we've said and staying compliant and within privacy laws? I don't know if we could talk about some examples that we've got in the US, which is a complex place given the start of the chat, all the different laws that you've got over there. Is there anything you can talk to there?
Yeah. So under GDPR, there's this idea of privacy by design, and it's not something that was invented by the European regulators. It's just something that was adopted when they built GDPR or when they made GDPR into law. Mm-hmm. It is a great starting place. So privacy by design, in a nutshell, is essentially thinking about privacy at the very earliest stages of onboarding a product or creating a new solution, right? So it's thinking about a lot of the things that I was just mentioning, right? So what is the retention schedule going to be for the data that you collect, right? What are the use cases? So there's a lot of things where we just kind of take the data for granted and we don't think about, okay, what do we actually need to use that data for? And if you can't come up with an answer for that, you shouldn't collect it, right? That's kind of in a nutshell, that's privacy by design. Yeah. More accurately, it's one of the principles of privacy by design, which is data minimization. But then there's also an aspect of, again, finding that commonality. So like you were mentioning, Barney, there's no way that you can be 100% compliant with every state, every federal, every country specific law. It's really finding the essence. What's the goal that they're trying to achieve? What is it that they want you to do to show that you're using data respectfully and appropriately? Yeah. Right. That's kind of the key there. And then on the governance side, which I know we haven't really talked a whole lot about, but there is an aspect of identifying the data and the use cases in the privacy side will actually help with your data governance when you get to that point, because it helps you understand what are the tags, what are the data quality metrics that you want to track that makes that data meaningful, because you've already identified what's your use case, right? If you don't know what your use case is, you don't really know what what the value of that data is, to put it another way. So that makes data governance hard, because you don't know how to track your quality metrics if you don't know what that quality is that you want.
Sure. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I know we're talking about cameras a lot here, and we've not even spoken about AI. AI is like playing a pivotal role, has done for a few years already, in technology on cameras for fleet managers, not just on cameras, in other ways as well. But you might need your crystal ball for some of this as well, actually. But it's an interesting talking point for us. But as AI technologies, including dash cams, as they become more prevalent, what else do organisations need to be thinking about here? Or actually, don't we know yet? Is there a sense of unknown with all of this? But
there is absolutely a sense of unknown, right? If you talked 2 years ago about typing into ChatGPT a question and then it writes you a 3-page answer, that'd be a movie, not real life, right?
Yeah.
And even that, 2 years later, here we are, we're talking about agentic AI, which is taking that a step further, and it actually takes actions on its own on your behalf based on what you ask it to get done, right? And so, I think there's definitely an aspect of we just don't know where it's heading, which it makes my previous statement all that much harder to complete, right? How do you know what your use case is going to be if you don't know what your use cases are because the technology is evolving so quickly?
Yeah.
Right. So that is something that I think every organization is dealing with on some level. The important thing in my mind is making sure you have the right controls in place. Because most folks are not building their own generative AI models, right? That takes a lot of computing power. You're usually gonna farm that out to the experts, right? You're gonna go to Google, you're gonna go to OpenAI, the companies that are building these models at large scale, right? So making sure you have the appropriate controls in place for the data that you're feeding into them, as well as contractual controls. But that's something that you would do before you get into the actual relationship. But having some really tight controls, which that goes into governance again. So governance and AI actually, in my mind, go pretty closely hand in hand, as does privacy, right?
Sure.
If you feed sensitive data into an AI that you don't mean to, it is all but impossible to get it back out, which means that model is now going to violate a law somewhere, right? It may not be in your specific state if you're in the US, but if you want to take that model and commercialize it in another state or another country, you're going to run afoul of the legal requirements there. So even if you're not necessarily thinking about, okay, hey, I live in I'm trying to think of a state that does not, Missouri, right? I live in Missouri. I want to put out this AI dash cam. So I want to take a feed and then add some AI detection to it. You have to be thinking more, unless you just want to sell in the state of Missouri, which, that's what you want to do. Great. But most people, right? A little bit broader market, right? So even if you're not necessarily thinking about, hey, I live in Missouri, so that's all I need to worry about. That's just not the way data works nowadays. Data is so easy to replicate and transfer. That's one of the beautiful things about it, right? That's what makes our modern society what it is. Yeah.
Fascinating times. Who knows what's around the corner with it, quite frankly. But I think that some of the stuff that I see us doing with it are all done for really, really positive reasons, and there's some great use cases out there that we could talk to. We won't get into it now and everything, but it's certainly elements of how is that data used. Some of it potentially incorrectly or in the wrong manner creates risk, right? Creates risk for organizations and those people processing and using that data. So great. So I know we touched on ethical considerations at the start of the podcast, but in relation to AI, what ethical guidelines should fleet operators follow when they're deploying AI solutions in the products that they buy and their operations?
So a lot of this is going to be, it's an ever-changing landscape, right? Especially when it comes to AI right now, there's a lot of development. So what applied yesterday may not apply today, and definitely won't apply by tomorrow. Mm-hmm. But there is an aspect of making sure that you've got good data or clean data going in to the systems. And what I mean by clean is you've stripped out any personal data or sensitive information. Again, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, if you wouldn't feel comfortable having your sensitive data put into this model, you shouldn't be putting other people's sensitive information or personal data into that model. Because part of the issue is once a stream of data or a subset of data becomes part of an AI model, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get that information back out of the model, which then makes it very difficult to sell or commercialize in any way if it's in violation of laws, right? And we talked about some of the privacy laws early in our conversation, but there are some new laws coming down the pike. They're not quite in effect yet, or enforcement, I should say. But they're coming soon, and they are directly regulating AI systems, right? So there's the EU AI Act as well as the EU Data Act, which is more of a governance-minded regulations, not necessarily directly governance, but it kind of has that flavor to it. So these are all things to keep in mind, while also keeping in mind that these AI systems, they are going to be on some level imperfect just because of the nature of how they were built, right? They were built by humans who are imperfect by nature, and therefore the product is imperfect by nature on some level. Although that's maybe a little too philosophical for our conversation, it does apply when we're trying to think about potential bias, right? Everybody, I would argue, almost everybody has the best intentions when they build technology. The problem is it's kind of unforeseen biases that come into play that we either are not thinking about or we're just actively ignoring, right? But it's things that have a detrimental impact when it comes to operationalization. So, for example, you have a dash cam that is meant to track driver alertness, right? If your pupil size or eye size is smaller than average or smaller than the data set that the AI was trained on, it will have a bias against people with smaller eyes, right? Again, I would argue 9 times out of 10, not an intended consequence, but it's a consequence nonetheless. And so it's things that some things we think about, right? Like, there's a lot of discussion about skin tone bias for AI systems, right? Or, socioeconomic biases in these AI systems, right? Those are kind of the ones that we have identified at this point. But there are others that we're not even thinking about yet that will come up in the course of this evolution of technology. And so part of it is just keeping in mind that this is an evolving landscape and making sure you've got your culture built up so that they can follow that, right? It's kind of it's what we talked about earlier, having a mentality in your company of, hey, that data set is somebody else's problem. That's IT's problem or legal's problem. That's going to be a short-sighted viewpoint, right? So if you can take it more of an example of, hey, everybody has a piece to play in this, and everybody has a piece to help identify bias, you're more likely to have a stronger output, not only from a technology standpoint, as far as not having as many biases, but also just from a commercialization aspect, right? Everybody wants a product that's going to do better in the field.
Yeah, totally. That's fascinating to hear you talk to it like that. So it sounds like, as we mentioned at the start of the conversation around AI, still loads and loads of unknowns, and I guess precedents that are still to be set in terms of how we handle these things that we're not aware of at the moment, right? I mean, that's a statement of the obvious, but a lot to learn and work out how we get around it or work with it.
Yeah, and it's scary and exciting at the same time.
Yeah, totally. Srikant, thanks for joining us today. It's been really, really insightful, and lots of great, insight on governance and data privacy that you've been able to share with us there. Really appreciate you joining.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the invite, and it was a fantastic conversation. So yeah, thanks, Barney.
You're welcome. So I think my takeaway from today's conversation is that while managing privacy and governance is essential for every fleet operator, it's often something that can be dealt with through consistent processes, good communications, and thinking through the risks with an ethical mindset. Thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with colleagues and friends who might benefit from these insights. We really look forward to having you join us on our next episode, where we'll continue to explore the topics that matter most to you and your business.